We'll start then by looking at features of the organisation, and you can see here that the actual wording is features and organisation of the sport and active leisure industry or business in the industry. So what key things are we going to look at? And again, remember, bear in mind this is an overview, we'll go into much greater detail, but the sorts of things that we need to get our heads around or at least be aware of what's coming up are these. So we're going to be looking, as we said, the features and organisations of the sport and active leisure businesses. So what do we really mean by that? Well, we're going to be looking at the aims and the objectives of the sport and active leisure business. We're going to be looking at the types of businesses that there may be involved. So small businesses, sole traders, through to big private limited companies, etc., and public limited companies. We're going to be looking at the scope, the whether it's national, international, etc., as well. We're also going to be looking at the way in which sports is provided through provision of sports facilities and programs for specific demographic groups and services that could be provided. We'll look specifically at customer groups and see how particular activities could be tailored for particular groups. The notion of stakeholders is really important, and their influence that they have on the businesses. And then lastly, we'll be looking at law, legislation and safeguarding. One of the things that you may have picked up in straight away there is that there's quite a bit of terminology, there's quite a bit of specific key terminology, which I think it's really important that your students get to grips with and start to use from the outset. Essentially, if we can marry up with what's required on the mark scheme and let our students know and make them aware of that from the outset, then we're going to be in a really good place. So I've got plenty of ideas to show you how we can continually support our students with using key concepts and key terminology, and that's obviously going to be pertinent for all of the sections we're going to be looking at. So that's the first one there, the features and organisation of a SAL sport and active leisure business. And just before we move on, if we put that back into our spider web, our link, and you'll begin to see as we go through this how all of this can link together. This is the idea of the big picture, and I think it's really useful for you to keep reiterating this and reminding your students of this point. So business models then, there are two business models that we are required to look at with our students, and the first one is what's referred to as a SWOT analysis. Now what you might find is that some of your students are perhaps doing business studies A-level as well, or have done business studies at GCSE, or have some sort of prior knowledge and experience of business, and they may be aware of what a SWOT analysis is. That's what it stands for: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. And we will spend significant time on this as well, because there's a definite way in which to do this in order to score highly in the assessment area. The second business model is called the PESEL model, and that stands for that. There you can see political, economic, social, technological, legal and environmental. Now, remember I said previously that the mark scheme stays the same, as does the structure and the requirements of the actual assessment. Of course, we're going to delve into that in more detail later on in the course. Our students only have to do either a SWOT or a PESEL. They only have to do one of those two business models, and so we need to be thinking about, do we really need to teach both of them, and in what detail do we need to do that? With that in mind then, my suggestion is that we think carefully about how much time we spend on the PESEL model, because more often than not, most students, and you possibly find this yourself, will use the SWOT analysis, partly because it lends itself, it's so much more easier to do the SWOT analysis with those four areas than it is with the PESEL. So something I think at this point to be mindful of is just a question mark against the PESEL model. Perhaps yes, we can touch on it, but perhaps it's better to focus on the SWOT analysis. And again, having looked at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats, if we take that back to our integrated model, we can start to see, well, what are our strengths in terms of our marketing or our human resources or our financial situation? What are our weaknesses? What are our competitors doing? And we can be aware of how that fits in to that bigger picture as well. Moving on, human resources is relatively interesting, and again this applies to any organisation rather than just specific to the sport and active leisure industry. Things we need to look at: jobs, roles and responsibilities in the sport and active leisure industry, person specifications, i.e. what is required, what each individual person is required to do for their role, the different types of employment, so is that permanent, is that temporary, is it part-time, full-time, etc. What does human resources do actually in terms of the department? What are the roles, what's specifically required to do? And also physical resource management, particularly in terms of things like facilities, equipment, etc. How is that all managed? And all of this, as I said previously, we need to make sure we've got a good range, a comprehensive range of the specification, and that's why we need to tackle these areas equally in a balanced way. And again, as we go through the course, we'll see how that fits in to our bigger picture. Moving on, marketing, as I said, this is probably quite an interesting area for students to tackle, and I've got some nice activities lined up for you a little bit later on this one. We're going to be looking at what marketing means, and again, this is all about learning key concepts which the exam board would expect your students to be able to do. We're going to look at the different types of marketing. Mainly we're going to look at the difference between traditional marketing and digital marketing, and hence there's a digital learning sort of activities that I've got lined up. We're going to look at the 7 P's of marketing, and you can see those there and how they fit in to whatever the sport and active leisure industry business might be for particular case studies that we'll be looking at. And then lastly, with marketing, we're going to look at the meeting the needs of the customer and how we can meet those needs to ensure that we give the customer what they want. So marketing is a really nice area to work with, and I think hopefully your students will enjoy some of the things that I've got lined up there. Again, it fits into the big picture very nicely in terms of business models, in terms of generating finance, what's happening in terms of trends in the business, and how we can promote what we're doing in our business to obviously get more customers and more revenue. Finance, as I said, we don't need to worry over much about it. It's just being aware of the sorts of things that are involved in running a business. So we would expect, I think, students to be aware of what's involved at a very general level in running a business. That includes these concepts here. So the concept of cash flow, fixed and variable costs, capital costs, operational costs and equipment costs. And don't worry yourself if you're not sure exactly what these mean. We'll go through all of them, and again we'll bring it alive in terms of a real case study so that we've got that thorough knowledge and understanding. And then we need to look at financial records as well, and that includes those that you can see there. So things like what legal requirements are required for a business, sales, payments, tax, purchasing, etc. We don't need to go into it in too much detail, and this is where, as I said in the past, I might have spent too long just teaching this stuff in isolation and not relating it to that bigger picture with the spider's web. Some of that stuff, I can tell you, we don't need to worry about too much. Yes, it's a good to know, it's nice to have, but actually how relevant it is in terms of tackling the assessment, it might be questionable. So don't worry over much about finance if that's something that potentially is causing concern. And again, we can see how finance fits into this bigger picture. I will make sure that you have these resources. You can download this PowerPoint I'm working with, and you can keep showing your students this big picture, because I think it's so crucial to the crux of what we're doing. And then lastly, we're going to look at trends. And what this means is the kind of developments that have taken place in society currently. So in this case, any kind of new technologies and how that impacts on things like participation. So there you can see the influence of the media, including social media. How do we use that to our advantage in terms of getting more people through our doors and spending money? What about the changes in national participation rates, and how is that having an effect on what we are offering? And you can see they're changing the numbers of participation and spectator numbers as well. So we need to be aware of what's happening in the sport and active leisure industry in order to adapt to those changes to ensure that we keep customers and we can attract new customers. And then developing products and services. So if we're aware of the trends and something that's happening in the industry, what can we do, or what can a business do in order to capitalize on that? And we'll look at the potential benefits of doing that, jumping on the bandwagon of a particular thing that's on vogue or trendy at the moment, or trending, but equally there are associated risks with that, and so we'll look at those as well. And again, that fits into the big picture. So hopefully we're beginning to see that it's totally integrated, it's very much interwoven, And that's why, as I said in the previous video, I really like this approach that you can talk about a number of different things at the same time rather than just looking at them in isolation. So that's our overview. That's what we're going to be studying. And then in the next few videos, we're going to go into each of these in a greater detail.